Thank you very much for the invitation today. I work, as Shane said, for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Yes, it's an absurdly complicated name, and I never criticize anyone who forgets it. But we are a non-profit news organization, and our mission is to dig deep and for a long time into global problems that equally affect someone living in San Francisco and someone living in New Delhi and someone living in Buenos Aires, for example. That means we do what we call cross-border investigations that usually last 6 months. Sometimes they can last 18 months. And I'm speaking today about what we're best known for, which are our investigations into the world's rich and powerful and how they use a hidden financial system located in tax havens and even in the United States itself to create wealth, amass wealth, and play by different rules from the rest of us. And I'm going to be talking about two individuals in particular. One of them is a Russian oligarch, so incredibly timely at the moment. And the other one is perhaps the most iconic or infamous case of alleged kleptocracy from the African continent in Angola. So let's start then with the first case, which is that of Mr. Igor Makarov. I meant to say, sorry, you probably know ICOJ if you know of us at all from our investigations called the Panama Papers or the Pandora Papers. They are our two biggest projects. And interestingly, everything I'm talking about today, interestingly and tellingly, is based on leaked documents. For those of you wondering where a lot of this information comes from, because ICOJ's investigations into the world's rich, powerful, and criminal have in large part come from leaked documents that we would never have otherwise have seen. And I think that's relevant to the discussion we're having because if not for whistleblowers, and if not for this leaked information that was passed to journalists, we would never know the secrets of how the rich, powerful, and criminally minded amass money and manage their money. And I think that's a sobering reality and a sobering lesson to take away from my presentations is that there's so much more happening that we don't know about. And even if now I've been on investigations that in total have had access to 40 million leaked documents, that's 40 million leaked emails, leaked bank records, passport photos and things. It's really just a drop in the bucket when it comes to this hidden financial world that we call the offshore system. So I'm going to start talking about Igor Makarov because he is a case of great relevance to us currently for a number of reasons. Igor Makarov is a Russian oligarch, as of last year at least, estimated to be worth more than $2 billion. And he was someone who was born in the former USSR in what is now Turkmenistan in the 1960s. I'm focusing on Mr. Makarov for a number of reasons, as will become clear. One of which is that earlier this year, the governments of Canada and Australia sanctioned Igor Makarov for his alleged complicity in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, I should at this point note that in my correspondence with Mr. Makarov's US lawyer, in the conduct of my investigation, we were told that Mr. Makarov denies having any personal relationship with Vladimir Putin and denies any wrongdoing in the past relating to activities that we're going to talk about. That's just me putting on my journalist hat there, a bit like when John Oliver does Last Week Tonight, if any of you watch those. So here's Mr. Makarov. Here's a summary of where he started, his birth, and where he is today. I actually just learned in preparing for this presentation that in February, Mr. Makarov, the home in Florida worth 16 million that he has resided in the past is now for sale. So if anyone out there has $16.4 million and wants to buy a luxury mansion in Florida, there's one going. And that perhaps not coincidentally came as pressure ramped up on him. We can obviously have a question about why the US hasn't sanctioned him and why it's only Australia and Canada in the state at this stage, but that can be for a later time. That's the Canadian announcement of Mr. Makarov being sanctioned earlier this year. when we talk about illicit wealth and when we talk about extreme wealth and inequality, Russia is one of the countries that comes first to mind. The word oligarch is obviously now on everyone's tongue. The word kleptocrat is also on everyone's tongue. And Russia has really navigated or dominated rather that particular nomenclature, which I find interesting. And it was really interesting to hear about the Philippines and the Marcoses as well, because really, let's be honest, kleptocracy and oligarchs are not unique to one particular country. They exist around the world. And I think today you're getting a good snapshot of different parts of the world and the United States' role in sustaining these oligarchs also, which we'll come to in a moment. So I included some of Mr. Makarov's background here just to really remind you of how it was that so many of these oligarchs have become incredibly wealthy. And I think there's been a lot of reporting around that in the past few months since Russia invaded Ukraine. But the way in which really in the 90s, as the Cold War ended, there was a huge rush for assets across Russia and across the Soviet Union that allowed certain people, either through their business acumen or in some cases through their connections to politicians, to become extremely wealthy extremely quickly. And Mr. Makarov, as you can see here, founded an oil and gas company that very quickly, within a decade, became Russia's main exporter of gas. I included also a reference to, in the 90s, the fact that there was reporting that Russia was investigating Mr. Makarov's company for alleged tax avoidance. And I also included a comment from Mr. Makarov's lawyer in that case as a way of showing you that in the context of Russian kleptocracy and wealth, nothing is clear. There are conflicting arguments on both sides. And we see that even with the sanctioned individuals. There are very few sanctioned individuals at the moment following the war in Ukraine who have acknowledged having amassed their fortune in any way underhandedly. And I think that's useful for us to keep in mind that Russia in the 90s, in the early 2000s, really before the consolidation of Vladimir Putin's power, was a country in which there were ups and downs and in which there still was contestation around wealth. The rise of the oligarchy is what we were just talking about, and this was a quote I took from a recent NPR story that really speaks to the mayhem of rapid privatization in explaining how it was that such a small cadre of individuals were able to become wealthy so quickly. In 2000, Mr. Makarov gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal in which he said he had to leave. He was under some time constraints because he had a dinner with Vladimir Putin at 7 p.m. 2000, of course, was the year that Putin became president for the first time in Russia. And I thought in my research that that snippet, albeit 22 years old now, spoke to the relationships between wealthy millionaires and billionaires and the Russian president at the time. I think very interestingly, this is another snapshot of Mr. Makarov and his history. He became incredibly wealthy and for a long time had a subsidiary of his oil and gas company in the United States. As I mentioned before, he has stayed at a residence in the United States before in Florida. And there was lots of media coverage in the mid-2000s about the FBI investigating a US congressman named Kurt Weldon, allegedly in relation to kind of activities or lobbying basically involving Mr. Makarov's company. Important to note that the congressman and Makarov and the company were never actually charged with anything, but it speaks to the history of this particular individual long having ties to the United States. In 2009, for example, overseas Italian media also reported that Mr. Makarov was investigated for potential ties to the mafia. And again, I'd say here that Mr. Makarov's lawyer has previously said that that is baseless and that there's no truth to that, although it was reported. This is the property in Florida that Mr. Makarov had resided in previously. I wanted to stop at this point to talk about some of the craziness of what it is to be wealthy in 2022. Certainly in my case, and I imagine in many of your cases, it's a very simple scenario. Either we own something or we don't own something. either I own, these glasses that I'm wearing, or I don't own it. For rich people, thanks to their legal advisors, their accountants, and their bankers, there are actually different ways to enjoy a property or use a piece of art or a yacht or a house without actually owning it, which makes it incredibly difficult for investigative journalists like me, but also for prosecutors and the FBI and others. And we're seeing that in the debate around Russian yachts at the moment. If you've followed any of the reporting, you will have seen that even though the US government and journalists seem convinced, for example, that Vladimir Putin owns a huge yacht called the Scheherazade, no one is actually able to say that with 100% confidence, because there are things called shell companies or companies that exist in offshore tax havens, for example, places like Panama, maybe, and also what's called straw men or straw women or nominees, someone who you elect to represent you on official documents. And therefore, in the law and in fact, you don't have to own a thing. And that's a very common tool used by the wealthy and the powerful, and also the criminals in general, that I've discovered in my reporting. And it ultimately becomes a bit of a word game. It allows wealthy people to say, Mr. Journalist, you are wrong. I don't own this house, or I don't own this yacht, or I don't own this private jet. It's not my name on the documentation. It's the name of my best friend from childhood, or it's the name of my hairdresser. Literally, I have looked at documents or investigated cases involving presidents of foreign countries, and the president is suspected of owning something, but on documentation, it's the president's favorite hairdresser, for example. And if that president and that hairdresser have a good relationship, then of course, for all practical purposes, the yacht or the jet or the home belongs to the president and is used by the president. But of course, that legal distinction means that it can be difficult for, say, the FBI or prosecutors to investigate. So the language I got around that house, for example, was the house is not Mr. Makarov's home. It is a home he sometimes stays at within the United States, which I think is probably language that you and I don't use very often to describe places where we stay, but it is an important part of contemporary finance and the world in which we live. As I said previously at the start of this conversation, a world in which if you have enough money and a strong enough desire, you can pay professionals to create an entirely different financial and legal universe that average people like you and I benefit from. And let's go to that now to focus on what I've been really reporting on for 10 years or so now, which is this parallel financial universe I talked about, the so-called offshore empire. Now, you've probably heard about places like Panama or the British Virgin Islands. Certainly the Marcoses had. Basically, these are tax havens that are famous for having low levels of taxation, but also incredibly high levels of secrecy. In a place like Florida, for example, or California, I can pretty easily go online or go to a public document and find who owns a company or who owns a house. In a place like Panama or the British Virgin Islands, that's very complicated. And these places, understandably, are of great interest to people wishing to hide something. Sometimes they're wishing to hide something because they robbed a bank and they don't want the police to know where they put their money. Sometimes they're wealthy people and they say they don't want to expose themselves to the risk of kidnapping. That's something we hear from Latin American millionaires and billionaires a lot, which is, yes, I own this bank account or this property, but it's not in my name because if it was in my name publicly, then gangs would come and kidnap me or my children, for example. So this offshore empire exists, this offshore world exists, and for decades now, it's been popular with the rich and the powerful and the criminals, as I've said before, from every single country. No single country is spared. I've seen rich people from the smallest country in Africa to a huge country like Russia or the United States who use these tax havens to shield wealth. The IRS in the United States and the Department of Justice have entire teams whose job it is to try and obtain information from these so-called tax havens to get behind the curtain or get behind the secrets and identify who's doing what. Why that matters is because, quite simply, if governments don't know where their citizens' money is, at one level, governments can't impose proper taxation. So why is it that someone who's worth billions of dollars can put money in a tax haven and pay less on that than I pay on my salary, for example, simply because I choose not to put my bank account in a tax haven? Of course, tax havens are also problematic because there's a long history of them being used to hide information and commit crimes. Nearly every case of bribery in the world by every politician has involved at some level or another shell company or a company in a tax haven. I think often when we think of corruption and kleptocracy, we think of a politician walking around with a suitcase stuffed with $100 bills. That may have been a thing in the past, and it wouldn't surprise me if the Marcoses did that. But in 2022, if you're a politician and if you want to steal some money, then you are going to use shell companies, you are going to use tax havens, and you are going to use lawyers, accountants, and bankers to help you do it. Now, to go back to the case of Mr. Makarov did what lots of rich people do, and there's nothing inherently illegal in this. He set up companies like the ones you can see here in places like the British Virgin Islands. And he set up a company. You own a company, for example, he owned a private jet, but he didn't own the private jet directly. It was a company of his that owned a private jet, and that's very common. Now, traditionally, I don't want to get too nerdy on you here, but Russian oligarchs, millionaires and billionaires, just like other millionaires and billionaires, they have their favorite tax havens. And if you love maps as much as I do, you could spend hours getting lost in this kind of thing. But Cyprus for a long time has been the favorite tax haven of Russians, for example. There were estimates that little old Cyprus, tiny island in the Caribbean, held on paper at least as much as 20 billion euros of Russian wealth, for example. So that's a lot of money that is legally held outside Russia, even if, of course, that doesn't mean that there's literally 20 billion euros in cash stacked somewhere in a bank vault in Cyprus. And I mention Cyprus because Mr. Makarov came to my attention, and I know his case well now, because in around 2016 or so, Mr. Makarov did something unusual. And that by Mr. Makarov, I mean his advisors and his professional advisors. Mr. Makarov's wealth changed its location from a tax haven in Cyprus that's well known, that is even infamous in some circles for enabling financial secrecy. And he moved it to this state. This is Wyoming. For those of you who don't recognize the photo, the state of, the cowboy state with its beautiful national parks and its, Stetson hats. So thanks to leaked documents, we were able to identify that the offshore companies and part of the offshore wealth of Mr. Makarov had in 2016 been moved from Cyprus, again, where lots of Russians hold their money, and moved into Wyoming, in Jackson in particular. Once again, that doesn't mean that any actual money or any actual assets moved into Wyoming. In fact, a big criticism of Wyoming is that there's no real benefit to the state of Wyoming except for a few lawyers who get paid very nice salaries to look after the wealth of extremely wealthy people. And again, thanks to these leaked documents that I was talking about, we at ICOJ were able to identify this move into Wyoming because the United States and particular states, especially South Dakota, Wyoming, Delaware, Nevada, Alaska, and a little bit New Hampshire, have actually over recent years aggressively tried to become the new Switzerland or the new Panama of the world. These smaller tax havens that you might have heard of are actually trying to clean up their game in many cases. They've come under such pressure for so long from governments for having hidden the money of criminals and corrupt politicians that some of these traditional tax havens have basically said, we're going to make it harder for people to hide money here. Guess who hasn't said that? States within the United States of America. And for the first time, these documents that we saw in the Pandora Papers gave us names and evidence of people who were moving their assets and in some cases hiding that money in the United States. There was, of course, Mr. Makarov, who is now sanctioned, but setting up secretive financial vehicles in the state of South Dakota were also, for example, people in Latin American countries who'd been accused of bribery, or people whose companies had been taken to court for alleged human rights abuses. So lots of important names and scandals emerged from this showing that the United States has now become the most important and the most damaging international tax haven worldwide, according to a new survey that came out just a few weeks ago. I wanted to share this structure with you just to show how crazy it is when you're rich, what you can do to basically manage your money and hide your money. I don't expect this to mean anything to you, but it's I think a very good summary of the way in which you and I probably don't work. If I wanted to own a home, the home would be registered in my name, right? Let's take a private jet, for example. If I owned a private jet, I could buy it in my name. But in the case of Mr. Makarov and other wealthy people, they can own a jet, but it's held through something called a trust, which then has a trustee, which you see in the middle, which is then is managed for the purpose of a private trust company. And then there can sit another trust above that. Once again, I don't expect anyone to really understand or follow what I'm saying. The real takeaway here should be things become really complicated when rich and powerful people want to manage their money and in some cases hide their money. And it's complicated because it makes it harder for journalists like me to do my job, but it's also harder for someone like the IRS to do their job. You've all probably read how the IRS is really struggling over the past few years, and the rate of audits of the wealthiest Americans has plummeted. In fact, you're more likely to be audited or get in trouble by the IRS if you earn $50,000 than if you earn $50 million a year, for example. And that's often because, as tax experts and IRS officials tell me, things are complicated. Things are deliberately complicated. And the IRS could spend 5 years taking to court a very wealthy person with a complicated structure like this. Or they could knock on the door of Will Fitzgibbon and say, hey, Will, we realize that you didn't declare this. Here's a fine. We found you out, basically. Back to Mr. Makarov then. In 2018, you've probably heard of something called the Putin's list. That was a list put out by the Department of Treasury that listed a bunch of oligarchs and senior Russian political figures. Mr. Makarov has rejected the basis of this list and said that he's not an oligarch and has no connection to Mr. Putin. But I include that because this was in 2018, and yet obviously individuals in the state of Wyoming were choosing to work for Mr. Makarov until as recently as earlier this year. Because ultimately, a lawyer or an attorney or a banker in the state of Wyoming or South Dakota or Delaware, they have the right to choose who they work for. And the big question now that we're seeing in the United States is, does the United States want to become a place where the world's kleptocrats and where best friends of Vladimir Putin can safely stash their money without any consequences? This was a map, it's terribly inaccurate, that kind of shows, once again, once you've got money, how widespread you can place things. We have Mr. Makarov, who was born in Turkmenistan, but now who lives in Russia, who used services of companies in Cyprus, which is number 2, to own a company in the British Virgin Islands, which is number 4, and who then also owned that company through a trust or another company in the state of Wyoming, number 3, for example. So I include this map just to show you how geographically diverse the wealth management and the financial secrecy structure is of a person with lots of money. So I'm going to talk about another ICIJ investigation, which came about, again, as a result of another leak of documents, in this case, 700,000 documents from people who work for Isabel dos Santos. That's a drawing of her in the middle there. Isabel dos Santos, for a long time, was famous for being, quote unquote, Africa's richest woman. She is from Angola, a very oil-rich country in South Central Africa. And for a very long time, she would have photos taken with celebrities. She would appear at fancy events in New York, across Europe, for example, and was celebrated as an African success story. Our investigation, however, showed that this African success story was in fact built on financial secrecy and built on insider deals that in large part rested on the fact that, guess what? This woman's dad was the president of a dictatorial regime for almost 40 years. And it turns out that that's kind of helpful when you want to make a buck. I don't know if this video will work, but I'm going to try it and see. This is a video that explains really the Luanda Leaks investigation and why it matters. And my hope is that your takeaway from my presentation today is not simply that rich people exist and rich people do dodgy things. It's rather that it doesn't matter where a rich person hides some money or takes some money, that what these people do have consequences on your life, on my life, and I would say just as importantly, or even more importantly, on the human rights of people in some of the world's poorest communities. Because every dollar that is extracted illicitly from a country, or every dollar upon which taxes are not paid when they should be by a wealthy person, is obviously one less dollar or a few less cents that a functioning state could use to build a hospital or build a school. And that's particularly the case in a country like Angola, where I think 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 children currently don't have enough to eat, and where poverty levels are incredibly high. Okay, that's it.
This is not simply a story about Angola. It's a global story.
Africa's richest woman, Isabel dos Santos, the daughter of former Angolan President José Eduardo dos Santos, Isabel's fortune is increasingly coming under scrutiny.
Eu sou uma mulher africana, sou angolana e, sobretudo, sou empresária e sou empreendedora.
Isabel dos Santos was the daughter of a president of an autocratic country, and she made a lot of money because of that.
A whole swathe of service providers, the bankers, the lawyers, the oil companies, the consultants, have allowed the extraction of the resources that belong to the Angolan people from their country into Western capitals where this money gets reinvested. A small elite has been able to keep a stranglehold over the resources of the country, use them to their benefit.
Isabel dos Santos' business background is her father's presidential decrees and her father's power. You had always the state providing the financial cover and the political cover for her. Isabel's commercial presence in Angola is omnipresence. Those who use cell phones go through the company in which she has shares, Unitel. In banks that are everywhere. Then when you talk about construction, cement.
E começamos com uma nota da PGR. De arresto no Tribunal Provincial de Luanda contra os cidadãos. Isabel José dos Santos.
There's an orchestrated attack by the current government that is completely politically motivated. My holdings are commercial. There are no proceeds from contracts or public contracts or money that has been deviated from public funds.
É bocado mais difícil porque está coberto de algumas empresas, conhecidas empresas fiscais, e que muito desse património está em nome dessas empresas.
What these documents show us is that you have enablers, companies, everywhere in many different countries, especially in our Western countries, who are ready to help people to move their money in a very opaque way.
Isabel dos Santos' case is a really interesting story to try to understand how all these huge world of enablers do business and do profit.
So that's an introductory video into this Luanda Leaks investigation that I think sums up so many themes of what I'll talk about briefly here and what the investigation showed. And really, I think the main takeaway is, and something that I learn in every investigation that I do, is kind of the financial and the justice equivalent of it takes two to tango. That is to say that corruption, tax evasion, tax avoidance, fraud, bribery, and economic inequality generally are not perpetrated or are not able to be achieved only by one person, especially when it comes to quote unquote developing countries. For too long, there's been this rather lazy narrative around, you know, the corrupt Nigerian. I mean, how many of us in this talk today have received an email from someone pretending to be a Nigerian prince who sends you an email to your Gmail account and says, pretty please, you know, I need your help, wire me $50,000. Certainly, there's probably some dodgy Nigerian dude behind that scam at some degree, but he or she is probably likely to put their money in an American bank, in a European bank. And certainly if they're a politician or if they're a little more advanced than just your average scam artist, in my experience, they have very close relationships with some of the world's most expensive lawyers and expensive accountants, and we'll talk about them in a bit. The Dos Santos story really then begins in Angola, but from the Portuguese colonization of the world. Portugal is often forgotten as a colonial power, but it was a nasty, nasty colonial ruler that in many countries didn't give up its colonial holdings until the 70s. And that includes in Angola, for example, where there was a very bloody civil war for a long time. And after a little bit of independence, Isabel dos Santos's father came to power, for example. And something that we as reporters love about this story is that Dos Santos, at least in her narrative, said that when she was just in her 20s, all she owned was a bar called the Miami Beach Bar. And I happened to go there in Angola when I was reporting on this story. And that's her humble beginning story. This is a person who, by the way, I think interestingly, has a Russian mother because Angola and the Soviet Union were close at the time. But Isabel dos Santos grows up very wealthy, privileged, and then comes back to Angola after having studied in London for a while as the favorite or one of the favorite children of the new president of this incredibly, incredibly wealthy African country, at least in terms of natural resources. You heard in that video that Angola is not a country that we think of a lot, I dare say, but it has incredible wealth in oil. It has incredible wealth in diamonds as well, not unrelated. Civil war and conflict, as you probably know, go often hand in hand with resources, the so-called resource curse, for example, and Angola has definitely been a victim of that in the past. This is hard to read and you don't need to read it all, but what we found in our reporting was, once again, not surprisingly, or perhaps coincidentally, or not coincidentally rather, once Isabel dos Santos's father comes to power, very quickly after, he does things like create a company whose job is to manage Angolan diamonds, and then part ownership of that company making money from Angolan diamonds is registered to, no surprises here, a company in a tax haven, in this case Gibraltar, which is a tiny little rock in the middle of Europe. It's not public at the time, but it later emerges that the shareholders of this new company making money from Angolan diamonds are Isabel dos Santos and her mother. So right from the very beginning, this is your classic story of 21st century wealth, in which someone starts to become exceedingly wealthy, thanks to financial secrecy, thanks to tax havens, and thanks to a nice gift from daddy in this case, for example. And that happens in a number of different services and sectors, including telephone companies as well. We were talking about Russia previously, and so I included this quote from Isabel's former husband. I say former husband because Syndicate Dokolo, who she married, died in a scuba diving accident a year or so ago. But this is a family, a very wealthy African family then, who publicly said years and years ago, before all of the scandals emerged, that the next oligarchs we see will not come from Russia. They will come from Africa. And I think that kind of speaks, I don't think that's how he meant it, but certainly in my head, as someone who researches and reports on wealth and inequality and financial secrecy, it's true that many of Africa's elites, just as many of Latin America and Asia's elite and Europe's elite, use the exact same financial systems that we've seen used by Russian oligarchs for years and years now, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Isabel dos Santos then very quickly, or over years rather, acquires a lot of investments. Angola is it's a big country geographically, but it's not huge in terms of its economy or even its population relative to some other African countries. And this is a pretty good track record. Someone who is the daughter of the president gets investments in a bank, in a big cement maker, which is important when a country is developing and trying to build new buildings. Angola's capital city, Luanda, for a long time was infamous as the world's most expensive city. This was a place where, even though half of the population were picking through trash and didn't have enough to eat, hotel rooms and going out for dinner could cost thousands and thousands of dollars. It was that expensive. Dos Santos also gets interest in cable TV and internet, in electrical infrastructure, in a supermarket. Basically, Dos Santos becomes everywhere, omnipresent in Angola, as we heard in that video. Once again, to remind you of what we're talking about here today, Dos Santos is not doing this transparently. Dos Santos or her husband. This is one example among many that I took from our investigation, for example, that shows the layers of opacity, or the layers of companies that make it hard to say who owns what. So if you look at the bottom of this graph, you'll see something called de Grisogono. That was, until after our investigation, a Swiss jewelry maker. I think Sharon Stone appeared at one of their public events, for example. They're a big deal. If you like nice jewelry, and who doesn't? De Grisogono was maybe something that you'd like to wear. Turns out that Isabel dos Santos' husband has an ownership stake in de Grisogono. But you see how it's not de Grisogono and then immediately that name, Sindicadocolo. You see how there are these three companies in between: de Grisogono Holding with little Luxembourg written, Victoria Limited Malta, and Victoria Holding Malta. All of that means, instead of there being a direct ownership link, there are three non-transparent companies in tax havens inserted in the middle that make it very difficult for anyone to actually know the truth. That means it's also very difficult for the Angolan state to know the truth in case they wanted to maybe ask questions or ensure that taxes were paid. So this is a classic structure in which a wealthy person owns a valuable asset, but does it in perhaps a very complicated way. Isabel dos Santos, like you saw in that video, says that she's never been involved in politics, that she's not a politician, and that she's just had good business sense, that she became Africa's leading female billionaire, not because her dad ran a one-party state for 40 years, but because she started to sell chicken eggs when she was 6 years old and just happened to be exceptionally talented in business. That is a narrative now that more and more people are questioning as a result of previous investigations, but also ICIJ's investigation. Here is a map that shows you a little of the companies and the tax havens, mainly known as secrecy jurisdictions, where Isabel dos Santos owned secretive companies or held interests in secretive companies. Some of the obvious ones in Europe, for example, Gibraltar or Malta, but also newer tax havens like the United Arab Emirates, you can see on the screen, but also, surprise, surprise, that little slice of yellow in the United States, for example, because once again, and you will learn now, if you don't already, that this is kind of one of my bugbears, the United States is a big problem when it comes to financial secrecy, and is a big problem historically and still today in allowing people from foreign countries to make extreme and in some cases obscene amounts of money and to enjoy that money in terms of US real estate, and also to hide that money from foreign tax governments. As you saw in the video, and something I want to make sure that I convey in this presentation is once again that Isabel dos Santos, like so many others, had a raft of what we call enablers who helped her every step of the way. You know, I am yet to meet in my reporting someone who is so smart and so wealthy that they know how to become a billionaire and to avoid taxes and to hide money from their government all on their own. The way that they do this is that they employ and pay very handsomely financial advisors, tax experts, bankers, and lawyers around the world. And to be perfectly honest, if you're a crook or if you're a kleptocrat, ideally you want to find a lawyer or a banker or a tax expert who lives in a country like America, who lives in a country that is not seen, quote unquote, as problematic. You know, if you wanted to avoid scrutiny, if you didn't want the IRS or the FBI to come looking for you, you'd be pretty stupid if you decided, hey, I'm going to go and find a lawyer from Tehran in Iran, or I'm going to find a banker from North Korea. Like, that's just sending out all kinds of red flags, right? So if you're a wealthy person, or if you're trying to hide money, you want to find someone who works in New York City, or who works in London, or who works in Geneva, for example, or Lisbon, in the case of Luanda leaks, remembering that Angola was a former Portuguese colony, so lots of people speak Portuguese there. We spend a lot of time looking at how companies and individuals working for firms that you might know help Dos Santos. This includes Boston Consulting, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and KPMG, for example, all with employees based in European cities for the most part. And thanks to the leaked documents, we were able to, in the case of PwC, for example, one of the world's biggest auditing and tax advisory services, finally put a figure on, okay, how much money have you made from working with someone like Isabel dos Santos? And we found out that the PwC had issued invoices worth more than $1.28 million between 2012 and 2017. And that's just what we know. It's likely to be a lot more. Now, $1.2 million, to be honest, when you're worth $2 billion, might not sound like very much, but it's the kind of money that these enabler firms are making from a whole raft of different wealthy people. In our experience, in the reporting that we've seen, PwC, for example, is also a very busy advisor when it comes to Russian oligarchs. And since the invasion of Ukraine, PwC and other of these so-called enablers have made announcements that they're going to stop work in Russia, or that they're no longer working for Russian oligarchs. But I've certainly heard some critics that say it's a little too late. You know, the fox is already in the henhouse. All of these oligarchs, all of these kleptocrats, millionaires and billionaires, they've been using services like PwC's for so long that in countries like Russia, outside big cities, there isn't enough money for public hospitals. Or in places like Angola, the inequality is already so rampant and the lack of development so ingrained that it's going to take a long time, if ever, for a country like that to turn its fortunes around. This is an example of some of the documents that I get to read every day as part of my job. I read lots of people's emails that they never thought that anyone would see. And my other piece of advice to you today is, if you are ever considering breaking the law or working for someone of an unsavory reputation, don't put things in emails, because it's more and more likely that those emails will be leaked to journalists like I. We could have a whole nother session talking about investigative journalism and the rise of big data and data leaks, but it's certainly something that's happening more and more around the world. And this is an email that, I mean, I don't speak Portuguese, but I've got the translation down the bottom. It's a discussion between bankers and advisors working for Isabel dos Santos. And they're saying that some bankers who refuse to do business like with her hear her name and they go running like a devil from the cross, for example. And I include that quote, not only because it's colorful, because it tells us something. It tells us that when there are some enablers, some professionals who think that they don't want to do business with someone because they have a bad reputation, because there have been reports that they're involved in corruption, there are still others who will step up to the plate and accept that business. And that's what we saw in the story of Luanda leaks, that groups like PwC, for example, were happy to work for Isabel dos Santos, even years after investigations had been published by respectable news organizations that had raised questions about the legality and the cleanliness of her wealth. Right, so that was, this was a great investigation that the Forbes did in 2013 that said, as best as we can trace, every major Angolan investment held by Isabel dos Santos stems from her taking a chunk of a company that wants to do business in the country, or from a stroke of the president's pen, her dad's pen, that cut her into action. So that was in 2013. And then in 2014, in this document, you can see here, PwC, once again, one of the biggest advisors of its kind in the world, is offering advice to Isabel dos Santos and her companies about building a beer factory. It's just like in the case of the of the Marcoses that you heard about earlier. Wealthy people seem to like to have their finger in all kinds of pies. These are just some good quotes that I put here. The one at the bottom, I think, sticks with me, which is, without the assistance of these people, that is, without the assistance of bankers, lawyers, tax advisors, PR consultants, the corruption schemes and money laundering that flows from it would be unable to happen. And we've seen a really strong interest and renewed interest in this issue of enablers. Just the other day, the United States Treasury Department announced that it was sanctioning luxury yacht companies who are suspected of having helped people like Vladimir Putin and other Russian oligarchs build and acquire and manage yachts. So we're definitely in a world now in which the focus is no longer strictly on the person who, quote unquote, stole money or corruptly obtained assets. It's looking into these so-called enablers. The LuandaLeaks investigation had an incredibly immediate impact at some level. Portugal, the Netherlands, and Angola, and Malta, I think, all opened investigations of some kind, including criminal, but also civil. The PwC head said he was, quote, shocked and disappointed by what employees at his company had been doing, which in my experience, reporting on a company like PwC is actually quite rare. They often prefer not to say anything at all. Delaware, this is Delaware. And again, you'll forgive me for harping on about America's role in international corruption and financial secrecy, but it's a huge problem. No surprises at guessing that Isabel dos Santos was also connected to a shell company in Delaware and used that, we believe, to buy a very nice luxury home in Portugal, for example. This is a summary of some of the impacts or some of the fallout from the LuandaLeaks investigation. Rumor has it, I guess I should have put the Adele song on here instead of Fleetwood Mac, might have been a bit more appropriate. But rumor has it that despite all of this reporting and despite all of this outrage that countries have made in response to the LuandaLeaks investigation, and despite the fact that in many capitals now it's taken as a given that, contrary to the initial understanding, Isabel dos Santos's wealth was acquired in shady means, on the back of insider deals, with the help of her father's autocratic government. Despite all of this, there are rumors today that, in fact, not a lot may eventually happen, that Isabel dos Santos might, in order to get herself out of a quandary, pay some kind of fine or some kind of restitution to the government of Angola, but that actually, once that's done, she might be able to move on with her life living as normal. That remains to be seen. It's a big question mark. There's been rumors also that Isabel dos Santos is living in Russia because she has she was born in former Soviet Union, so has ties there. So the Isabel dos Santos story is far from over. What this investigation did, though, was really take one iconically wealthy person and show that that wealth was made not in isolation, but with the active assistance of professionals who wear suit and ties and high heels in New York City and Lisbon and Geneva and London. And that unfortunately is the only way that wealthy people can, in 2022, move money around the world freely. And this class of enablers is really central to the inequality that we see in the world today. And that if we lived in a world in which lawyers, bankers, accountants, and tax advisors had some standards of well, some would say if they had some moral compass, we'd be in a better place. Many critics out there also say, you know what needs to happen? Bankers, lawyers, and accountants, when they do something wrong, and when they represent people and help people who are suspected of being involved in financial crime or corruption, these advisors should actually go to jail. That has not happened a lot in the past. You've probably heard of the phrase too big to fail when it comes to banks. You've probably also heard of too big to jail. But more and more, there's a growing movement that says these enablers, these professionals are not going to stop just because you fine them $1 million or just because you fine them $500,000. You need to send bankers, lawyers, and other people to jail when they break the law, obviously, and when they enable the kind of financial crime and inequality that many of these kleptocrats, oligarchs, and billionaires represent. I'm going to finish there, and I look forward to hearing more from you and taking a few questions. Thanks, Shane.